Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for coming. I thought you were going to slide off at lunchtime, and I was going to be, as usual, talking to my wife alone. So it's very nice you all came back. Thank you. Now, this morning, you heard two of the best scholarly voices I know on this really fascinating subject of Iranian Sufism as interpreted by Henri Corbin. And I personally find it a tremendously important subject, partly because it sits between the East and the West. It incorporates much of the East. But secondly, it is a tradition that missed the full impact of the Enlightenment, which did so much to, I was about to say wipe out our mystical traditions, which wouldn't be too far wrong, I think. And so it is a really wonderful, wonderful tradition to return the individual to themselves. And I'm speaking, of course, not as, I must make it very clear, I am not a scholar of the Sufi tradition of Islam, any more than I am really a scholar of Henri Corbin. What I have to say to you today was fashioned by my incomprehendingly beginning to be a psychotherapist and wondering what on earth that was all about, and the impact that Henri Corbin had on my work as a psychotherapist. Now, so therefore, I should say there would be some finer points of doctrine that I might be a little bit hazy on, but I hope you'll approach that generously. Now, I always like to start with a poem because poems have a beautiful habit of saying in a few words what most of us say in millions of words, and we do suffer, I think, from, in some senses, a surfeit of words. And we didn't see each other's talk, so we weren't able to work out what they were saying, so I wouldn't say it again. So, but interestingly, the poem I have chosen is from Rilke. And this is a very beautiful poem called The Unicorn. And I think let's just use, because of course the unicorn is a mythical creature, but just let's use, in this poem, while you're listening to this, use the unicorn as a creature of mystery, because that's really the world we're going into. So Rilke says, and actually you'd help yourself when I refer to in the poem they, that's you. So this is a creature that has never been. They never knew it. And yet, nonetheless, they loved the way it moved. Its suppleness, its very neck, its very look, mild and serene. Not there, because they loved it, it behaved as though it were. They always left some space, and in that clear, unpeopled space they saved, it lightly reared its head without a trace of not being there. They fed it, not with corn, but simply with the possibility of being. And this conferred such strength, its brow put out a horn. One horn. Whitely it stole up to the maid, to be in her silver mirror and in her. Now, this is, and actually much of what both our speakers this morning were trying to say is contained in that poem. It's really an extraordinary poem because I can't remember why it's because, oh yes. we sense in this poem that there really is an invisible reality here. Something that was not there enters her. And this is my experience when I work as a psychotherapy with the images that arise in. I think those of you who came to my first talk will know that I don't refer to them as clients. I think clients are sort of for garages and things. I call the people who come and work with me simply fellow travellers. So those those fellow travellers come and see me. Now, what I want to do in the time we've got together is just touch on 5 areas. So we've got quite a lot to do. I want to just have a look at psychotherapy itself. Where it's come from, where it might go to. I want to have a slightly more forensic look at the imagination itself, particularly as articulated by Corbin. Because Corbin has a lot to tell us about how it works, how it works and what it heralds. And as a result of that, I obviously want to just have another look at the Alam al-Mithral, this world of images, because images play such a central role in all of us, and how we might learn to relate to those images. And linked to that, I just want to touch on the art of visualization, which is the essential tool in learning to work with the images that arise in us. And in that context, I want to just touch on how imaginative vision can help us in the question of disease, how we may learn to have a different relationship to that which arises in us. And last of all, I want to touch on what Corbin calls the science of the heart, and how a little of that magic gold dust might help us in a practical way. Now, we use this word spiritual, and my experience of using the word spiritual in England is that everyone looks out of the window and begins to shuffle their feet. They get sort of frightened. Not, of course, to an audience like this, but you probably sort of know what I mean. People get just spiritual. I use the word here, probably theologians will all lock me up for this, but I use it simply in the sense to signify that which is not material, that which is not material, not accessible to the 5 senses, but that which heralds and reveals a certain mystery viewed through the creative imagination. Now, I hope it's not too mean, but I want to just dwell on my own experience of the Christian tradition. Because I don't want to run down the Christian tradition, because I think how can you run down? It's so vast. But as I had experienced it, it seemed to have got a bit stuck in a sort of literal, historical, and particularly dogmatic vice. And by dogma, and belief. So that what we're really left with is dogma, some sets of ideas which we were conditioned as children to believe, said our creed, all that sort of stuff, and we had to believe it, we had to have faith in it, and that was pretty much what it was. Now, it's not that Christianity doesn't know how to do the mystical. Of course it does. You've only got to go back to Burma and Eckhart and John of the Cross and all these wonderful people. But they were all prior to the 17th century. And we're not, maybe I just don't know about them. We don't seem to be making these characters these days. And it's not that the dogma doesn't stand for something profoundly real. It's just that I seem to think we've actually lost a living connection to it. And that is a problem. What a huge difference when our Sufi sheikhs cry, "Pray to your Lord as if you can see him." No doctors of the law telling you what you should see, but pray to your Lord as if you could see him. And just, if I may, this is not in my notes, but just a little digression, which David touched on so beautifully. Okay, so you know, how do you do that? How do you find the Lord to pray to? David touched on it. I just want to increase it a little. Who am I? And this takes you straight back into the teaching of Ramana Maharshi, for those of you who may know him, who is a saint of such clarity and excellence. Who am I? Who am I? Asked 10,000 times, over and over again, until you get a response. And then, if you're lucky, your heart will fill up with something. And then you've got a Lord. Ish. But we go on reciting the old dogmas that support the old beliefs, and we wonder why our churches are being abandoned, why direct, authentic spiritual experience seems to be quite rare. We might also wonder why we have this absolute endless fascination with more and more and more information, more old data, more stuff, all driving our whole world down into deeper and deeper complexities, way beyond, from my point of view, what is actually useful. And we might begin to wonder why our way of thinking and doing seems to be destroying the planet. You know, perhaps Nietzsche was right when he said God is dead. Perhaps indeed the God of the dogmatic faiths is dying. And we must now re-experience the living reality that is our heritage. And if all cannot do that, which they probably can't, at least in those who lead us. It seems to me particularly poignant that we have an archbishop who has depression. Now, you know, it's a terrible thing to suffer, but if you are the head of a spiritual order, you might have learnt a little bit about depression. Anyway, that's just an aside. Because I think in time we will find we simply can't live without this dimension. I think we'll go crazy. I think we've lost something profoundly important and we have to reconnect with it. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So let's just have a quick look at psychotherapy, which is the vocation that came and got me. First of all, I have to say that I think psychotherapy is a noble art. Perhaps not always practiced as one, but I do happen to believe it's appropriate. And it does seem to be the latest attempt for man to know who he is, and an attempt to return an individual to his own personhood. And it is, of course, a veritable face-to-face, one to the other practice. But one has to remember that this whole profession, as it is practiced now, was a post-Enlightenment art. It developed out of a European mindset that was already becoming secular, scientific, more concerned with matter, and certainly unspiritual in any of the senses that I have chosen to use the word. But if you just listen to the language, not the music, but listen to the language of the Bach cantatas or of Handel, and you can just sense the world we've lost. Nobody speaks like that now. Now, this whole field of psychiatry, psychotherapy, and actually I would have to include medicine, which is an outrage because I'm not a doctor, but why not, is an abstraction. It's an abstraction, and an abstraction is always abstracted from something, from a greater whole. And this whole field has been abstracted from a pre-Enlightenment vision of man that saw man as an essentially spiritual creature in a divine cosmos. A single man, a singular particularity in an essential unity. Very generally speaking, science took over and destroyed the possibility of that elevated view of man with its insistence on the importance and utility of matter. And in my field, the general descent into the use of increasingly dangerous mind-altering drugs as the first line of defense against turbulence in the heart and mind, I'm sure we will come back in time to look on as an absolute disgrace. And it develops out of a wholly impoverished view of man as a mechanical organism to be tinkered with, a view that I truly believe to be just ignorant. So for me personally, a practice such as psychotherapy must in the end find its way home under an overarching, universal, perhaps non-religious, but universal spiritual view of man and of his world. For if man really is a creature with spiritual attributes, and the arts of psychiatry, psychotherapy and medicine treat him as if he's just a complex and sophisticated hunk of meat, it's not very surprising if there are limitations to that way of approaching him. And you'll probably be familiar with what we call CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, its very title makes me shiver, because it's simply this. It's a manipulation of this thing with absolutely no reference to the intelligence of the whole, which I shall be coming back to. Conversely, if we treat man as if he or she is a spiritual creature with those attributes we call spiritual, with tools that are based on those principles, I think you will be completely astonished how he or she may react in both body and mind. But as I've said before, generally speaking, though these professions don't actually have the simple tools to reconnect us to this view of man, to this other reality, this reality of the spiritual mystery inherent in man, which he is embedded in, whether he knows it or not. And as I think David touched on this morning, if you reflect on it for a moment, if you're really honest with yourselves and reflect on it, man's principal relationship to the world today is to think about it. So we look at a tree and we say, well, that's probably it could be a chestnut or an ash and it seems to be dying. So we don't actually allow the tree to inform us what it is. And think this faculty of thinking tends to pile up more and more information unless it leads to genuine insight, in which case it obviously has a very real value, which then may lead to some real knowledge. Now, these fellow travellers on the road who bless their socks, come and talk to me, are very often completely exhausted trying to think themselves out of the particular problem they find themselves in. A habit, I might say, much exacerbated by Google, and particularly so if you have a material disease and many hours spent looking on all this exciting stuff. I think it's worth just reminding ourselves in the East, particularly in India, all this thinking, all of it, is considered as pure ego activity and has absolutely nothing to do with the deep underlying mystery and certainty of life itself, to which the great sages and our own European mystics pointed with such clarity. And I think it's not unfair to say now the cult of the ego is about all we've really got. People seem to be profoundly, out of fear of whatever reason, it's all they've got left. They have to either make themselves safe, because there's no faith in the system of the whole creation, they're left with their own little egos holding the ceiling up all on their own, wondering why that feels rather exhausting. You see, I had to ask myself, and I imagine many of you have asked the same question. Are we actually really spiritual creatures? Do we have a real spiritual dimension that we can truly fall back on? I mean, how would we or could we possibly know? Because, as David Slide pointed out, that conditioning with all that belief and stuff and all that stuff was really what we were left with. So we can't really, it was very difficult to affirm these things outside the established dogma, which, as both our speakers made so clear, once you've got the dogma, the danger is it becomes a dead angel, absolutely fixed, immovable, against recurrent creation. So as I said, for me, psychotherapy needs to find tools that are at least cognizant of spirit, of the spiritual dimension. And to establish this as a practice, my first stop would be to revalidate the creative imagination as the greatest, the preeminent psychological and spiritual tool for perceiving spiritual realities. My particular hero was Carl Jung, and he did much in that field to remind the West of this dimension. But I think there's much more that can be done. And in revalidating this business of the imagination, for me, nowhere is this more beautifully outlined than in the Sufism of Iranian Sufism and Corbin's commentary on it. So that brings me really to the imagination itself. And just let's have a little bit of a think about this, because we all use the word and we sort of think we know what we're talking about. Now, this faculty we have called imagination, in the West, we have wholly degraded. We really, if you just think of the word itself, imagination, it's like, well, that's just sort of, imaginary. It's not really real. It's imaginary. And quite honestly, if you look around at sort of advertising and Disney and so on, you sort of, you're hard pushed not to think that. Jung pointed out very clearly that he felt we had completely degraded the imagination, and that there was something really, really wrong with the way we used it. And he says, the evil we are suffering from, and I'm actually paraphrasing a bit, but the evil we are suffering from is an imagination that has become incapable of linking the two parts of the universe, the visible and the invisible. Now, it is these invisible worlds, these mysterious invisible worlds, that science in a way has such, our sort of science has such contempt for, and that which we really do have to reconnect to. And unless we can truly understand the weight and validity of how the imagination creates, we're just never going to do it. In his great work that Tom referred to this morning, Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, which is a hell of a title, which actually is now shortened to the Alone, which I much prefer, because it is actually a title that tells you exactly what the point of this whole work is. But in that work, Corbin outlines really two principal ways in which the imagination works. And he calls the first sort of psychological, personal imagination of the subject. And that is split into two bits. And then the second bit was cosmic imagination. So just to say a little bit about the first, psychological imagination, because I think when we talk about the imagination, it's really important to understand what we're trying to say. Now, the first bit of that is where you individually command your imagination to create something. And if you'd like to just close your eyes for a moment, and I'd like you just to imagine a house. And I'd like you to go up to the front door of that house, go into it, close the door behind you, and stand in that house and just feel the texture. What's it like to be in that house? And now open your eyes. Now, interestingly, I said imagine a house. Some of you will imagine your own house, some will imagine your parents' house, some of you will imagine your grandparents' house, some of you will imagine a house you've never seen, which may or may not lie in the future or something. Had we gone on in that journey into that house, we would have begun to meet figures, and our adventure into this world of mystery would have commenced. The house you chose, I didn't choose it, your psyche chose it, but the very house you chose is full of significance. So that is an example of where you say, I want to imagine a house. You didn't say which house. The psyche did that for you. The house appeared, and we have to go back and think about, how does that happen? Now, so that's one example of the personal, subjective psychological imagination. Now, the second one is, in that first subsection, second one is where the imagination appears without your personal command. And what would this would obviously would encompass dreams. By and large, when you dream, you don't say what you're going to dream. The image appears. And these are the great dreams. The great dreams, you meet them in the Bible, and Joseph dreamed a dream and so on. You meet them very much in people who live traditional lives close to the land, great prophetic dreams that got the tribe moving or whatever it is. And they are very often directional and tremendously inspirational. Now, at the danger of telling you again, if some of you at my previous talk, I just give you the dream I had, which changed my life and pointed me in the direction of psychotherapy. I'd had a series of careers, none of which had been particularly successful, but hadn't been particularly disastrous either. But then I had a whole series of accidents, and various things went wrong. And I ended up in Italy, exhausted from these various adventures. And there I dreamt this tremendous dream in which I was sitting on a beach, and in my left hand I had a plant. And the plant was dying. And it was attached to the soil by a very thin root, and the root was about to break. And a sound really commanded me, and I placed the plant back into the soil, and it started to grow. And the sound was actually a name, and the name was Jung, Carl Jung. Now, all that, you don't have to be an archbishop to work that one out, I don't think. But the truth of the matter is, I knew absolutely nothing about Jung at all. Jung wasn't the sort of thing where I came from. You weren't particularly interested in. But as a result of that, I bought 14 volumes of Jung, and I read the whole lot, and off I went and became a psychotherapist, and here I am. So that's an example of one of those truly inspirational dreams. You have to say, where does this image come from? Now, I just touched on the so that is the first half of the personal subjective imagination. The second is what Corbin calls the cosmic imagination. And this is of a different order and slightly harder to grasp. If any of you have read Tom Cheetham, he does it with a burning bush, I think, don't you, in one of your books. Moses sees the bush is burning. Another person wouldn't necessarily have seen the bush was burning unless he also had spiritual attributes. But that was where the imagination is separate from the subject, but is still perceived. Now, apparitions fall into this, begin to fall into this category of cosmic imagination. But I've seen it more clearly, I think, in the subject of beauty. For beauty in this tradition has an especial place, not just because the imagination is involved, but because it was considered that beauty was a theophany. And it's a word that's been used this morning, I don't know if you all understand that, where theos is present. There is a presence there of something higher. Now, happening such as that, where we are moved by beauty or a bush burning. I just personally haven't seen many bushes burning myself, but I mean, but beauty, all of you will be familiar with. It is to me part of the beginning of the real mystery, because the beauty drags you forward with longing. You long to have a relationship to this beautiful thing, whatever that may be. But as the Sufi sheikhs warn us so beautifully, they say, woe unto he who imagines that his longing for Baghdad and Tehran is indeed for Baghdad and Tehran. So just be a little bit careful. Don't get stuck on the object, because what's taking you is the longing, and the longing is, if you like, the ship of your transcendence, the thing that moves you along to higher and higher beauties, until we are told in this tradition, I have no experience of it, that if you keep going, you may contemplate beauty itself. So all these activities of the imagination, cosmic, psychological, involve images. And in the way this tradition articulates that, they see that as taking place in a concrete spiritual world that sat between, as David showed us so clearly, between the heavens and the material earth, which they call the Alam al-Mithral, the world of images. And this plays such an absolutely seminal role in this tradition, and was really the thing that turned me on my head. Now, before I just do that, I want to just touch on this business of visualization, because visualization is an absolutely essential tool. And actually, I see I've really written a whole paragraph about it, but actually you've just done it. Because I just said, imagine a house, and you produced, that is a form of visualization. But visualization is the tool that we use to go down into our inner worlds. And we have to leave behind this wretched thing, the thinking faculty, which causes us such tremendous distress half the time. And the way I do that as a practitioner, I get you to do exactly what you've just done. You close your eyes, and we go in to contemplate what needs to be contemplated. Now, this might be a dream. It might be figures in a dream. It might be a specific figure in a dream. It might be horrifying. It might be benign. It might be violent. It might be all sorts of things. It could be a terrible state of mind that you feel located in the chest, so we would go and look at it. And for me, and this is absolutely not in this tradition, for me it could be a tumor, a cancer, a feeling in the gut, a whatever. It could be in the body. And we have to visualize that concrete thing, not think about it, try to interpret it, sort of think. Because this is, for me, where the savagery of man comes in with these gifts. We have to create a relationship to the thing in itself as it presents itself to us and see what the image has to tell us, rather than doing what arrogant man is so good at, saying, well, of course, I think it's a bit like this and a bit like that, and it could be this and it could be that, and on the other hand, it's something else. And I think of that. You do that, you end up with dead angels. And I'm just going to tell you a lovely story, which again, did many people here hear my first talk at Temenos? Well, a few, yeah. Okay, not too bad. Well, I want to tell you this again because it's almost like a parable. But I was working with a young man who had been paralyzed with anxiety, absolutely paralyzed with anxiety. His life was falling apart, he couldn't go out, he couldn't drive, he was in a mess. And he came to see me. And this sounds a bit mean, but he'd done a year of CBT therapy. And he'd gone to his doctor, and he'd actually said, this is the way I've got to go deeper. He said he had an intuition that something was not right. Now, normally when a fellow traveller comes along to talk to me, we have a little ritual, and I have to find out about what they're up to and what they do and where they came from and what their problems are and so on. This guy had hardly got into the room, and he said, I just had the weirdest dream last night. So I said, okay, well, should we scrap the formalities? Should we hear the dream? He said, yeah. He said, I was fishing in a lake. This is biblical. I mean, just listen to this language. It's so extraordinary. I was fishing in a lake, and I'd been there all night and caught nothing. And as the dawn breaks, a figure passes behind me and says, oh, if you want to catch something in here, you've got to go much deeper. And at that point, he looked down at his fishing rod, and there on the fishing rod reel was a dial which said 500 fathoms. So he whacked it across to 500 fathoms. He went, chucked the bait out, bang, was into a huge fish and woke up in terror. So I said to him, look, this is a little unusual, but I think we better just go fishing. Brilliant idea. Now, so here's a lovely, lovely example of visualization. So he closed his eyes and said, just go back and stand on the lake. The lake, the image of the lake, the imagination, gift, brings up the image of the lake. Yes, I'm standing. Now, are you ready to chuck your bait out? I am. And I'm setting the reel to 500 fathoms. Great, chuck it out. Bang, out goes the bait. Bang, I'm into a fish. Literally. And he was like this. I'm into a fish. You know, he was trying to sort of bring it in. He drags this thing up the beach in his visualization and then goes absolutely silent. And a look of deep sadness came over his face. And I left him there for about a minute, and then I said, well, what's happening? And he said, it's rotten. So I had to do some pretty fast thinking at that stage. So I thought, okay, I said, look, I'll tell you what to do. Can you sit down cross-legged on the beach, put your rod aside, and just contemplate this rotten fish? So he does. Now, I promise you, about half a minute later, you would have thought somebody had plugged him into 500 volts. His head snapped back, he opened his eyes, and he said to me, I have never experienced such terror. But it's gone. And it had. And his anxiety was over. And what had happened was, he'd been involved in a car crash a couple of years before, in which his sister had been killed. And I think there was some guilt or something there, or what, I don't know. But the fact is he'd repressed the whole lot. And there it had gone down into the unconscious. But it hadn't gone away. And it pressed upwards. This terror pressed upwards in the form of acute anxiety, which paralyzed him. So the important thing for me about that particular case is this. That if we try to interpret the fish, that, well, of course, you know, the Christians were very interested in fishes. This is a bit rotten, you know. We could have gone down that line, and I think we would have gone nowhere. But by a direct contemplation of it, by allowing the image as gift to speak its own mystery, a transformation took place. Jung didn't call these images, symbols of transformation for nothing. How are we doing? How long have I had?
Yes, plenty of time.
And how much longer have I got?
Well, you've got till 3:50.
Blimey, we better get on with it. Okay. So that's the point I want to make, because I think it's so important.
Sorry, you've got till 3:45.
That sounds far too long. What's the time now?
We can split the difference.
Okay. Okay. So I've still got some time. What? What have I got?
It's 3:30 for tea.
I know, but we
Yeah. I say, if I want questions, it's 1:15, and if it's not, I go on. Okay, I've got it. Okay, we're doing fine. So, to me, this is a wonderful example of how arrogant man has become. These images are gifts, and we just can't wait to get our hands on them and do something with them, turn them around and show how clever we are, when all we really have to do is to contemplate. So this Alam al-Mithral of the Sufis was, I think, a profoundly important insight. And as I think I've said before, I'm sure it's where all the miracles of our own Christian tradition took place, the plane on which they took place. David quoted it this morning, but I'll quote it again, because Corban says of this world, between the world of pure spiritual lights, which we know probably not very much about, and our sensory and material world, which we seem to know far too much about, there opens an imaginal world, which is a concrete spiritual world of archetypal figures and apparitional forms, and vision into it is vouchsafed to the creative imagination. Well, you can't be clearer than that. Let me give you two nice examples, because examples really are so much, I think they're so beautiful of how this really works. But it was this insight into this world that transformed the way I worked as a psychotherapist. And I started to really take these inner realities, these inner figures in dreams, the content of the dreams, the setting of the dream, much more seriously. A lovely girl who'd come from Eastern Europe, came with an enormous amount of fear. Didn't like going home at night, didn't like the streets, frightened. But she was a strong girl, and she was in her own way quite powerful, but she was full of fear. And she wasn't actually really a client of mine, but we had a chat. And I said, do you have any repetitive dreams? Because where the dreams repeat, you need to pay attention. Something's got caught, it needs to be freed up. Oh yes, she said, I have actually two things that happen in my dream. And I said, well, tell me. She said, well, one recurring dream is I'm always stuck on the top of some steps. And I have all my friends with me, and they all leave, and I can't get down to follow them. I thought, that's interesting. And the second dream? Well, the second dream, I'm always being chased by this huge lion, which is really terrifying and quite angry. So it's very interesting. So I said, let's just go and have a look at this. And so we do a visualization. Could you go back onto the top of your steps? Yes, I'm on the top of my steps. Just have your friends around you. Yes, my friends are around me. Have your friends leave. My friends have left. Can you come down the steps now? Absolutely out of the question. No way. Too frightening. Okay. So I then said to her, why didn't you call for the lion? He's coming. He's coming. He's very angry. Can you get him up the steps? He's coming. Will he sit beside you? He's sitting beside me. Can you put your hand on his head? It's on his head. Can you come down the steps? We're down. So I said to her, well, you could give it a spin. I mean, when you have to travel home late at night and your friend, see if you can have that lion beside you and see what it feels like. Because for me, the lion chasing her was her own power, was her own strength, her own courage, everything. But it was chasing her. She needed it. Here. It made a difference. That's all I can tell you. It made a difference. And my second story of that sort of category of using imagination, which I'm sure is not what our Sufi sheikhs did, but anyway, it's what we do in psychotherapy, was a lovely, lovely story of a boy who came, and he was in the sort of trouble that there's a lot of around these days, crashing cars, drinking too much, into drugs, you know, that sort of stuff. And he was in a mess. And we did a central visualization, which is the absolute standard visualization I do, which is a visualization of the child. And the child visualization can break grown men apart when they reconnect with that part of themselves. And they will weep, and I've told stories about this. But is it a divine archetype? I don't know. It might be. But it's certainly an unbelievably powerful connection. And in this case, so the way I do that, incidentally, I would have done exactly what I did to you. I'd have taken him into the house, and I then said, now, you're in the house. Now, I want you to do a little bit of, really do a little miracle. While you're standing in that house, call for yourself as a child. The child appears. Now, in this case, the child appeared, and this boy, who was 23, 24, breaks down in tears and weeps. When he's come to, I say to him, what's happening? And he says, I feel so ashamed. I said, really? Why? He said, because this beautiful kid, he only wants to make something beautiful. And I've been drinking and taking drugs and crashing. And he's now a gardener. Not bad, really. Not bad. So in these cases, like something inside wasn't right. And the gift was, both these cases, either with visualization where we commanded the image, or by the gift of a dream, a piece of the jigsaw puzzle came home. Let's just think for a moment about what are these images. You know, we sort of take them for granted, well, you have the imagination, you have images. But what on earth is going on? Where do they come from? Now, in this tradition, it's rather beautiful. But there is an angel called Spirit who dishes out the dreams. I go along there. I'm perfectly happy. I don't mind that at all. But certainly, I didn't get there through that. I got there by thinking, what's happening? Where people said, oh, well, of course, images come from the brain. Sorry. Not if you realize that's just not possible. But if you take this tradition and say an angel of spirit dishes out the dreams, it must make us pause a little when considering the nature of the image in itself. From whence does it arise? What presence does it herald? And actually, what does it say about our spiritual state? For the image is quite clearly a form. Something deep in the psyche, as I would describe it, has taken a form. An impulse, an energy, some spirit, something has taken a form. And in this tradition we'd say it has taken form in the Alam al-Mithral, where, as David said, spirits take form and bodies are spiritualized. Clapham Junction, I always call it. So these images take form, and it is our job to contemplate them for, dare I say, our completion and our wholeness. Now, as I've said before, and perhaps I'm being over-apologetic, but I said I'm not at all sure that our Sufi mystics would approve of any of this. But I simply have to say again and again and again that the image seems to arise when we ask that old Grail question, what ails thee? What's wrong? Now, why can we not say these images are gifts to help us along the road? Why can we not claim that they are a sort of living water? For this is what the effect they seem to have. Now, such very ideas will, of course, be instantly mocked. for they'll be considered to have no basis in so-called scientific reality. And they will be deemed unscientific, illogical, and new agey and vague. Savagely opposed by the doctors of the dogmatic faith because the image doesn't conform to the images that the dogmatic faiths have said that's what you believe in. But that doesn't mean to say that these images are not in their own way true. And I put them at the absolute heart of the way I work. Now, I want to just touch on this business of the imagination or as an organ of vision in the matter of disease. Now, I have to confess this is not something that came out of Corbin, and indeed in some ways it runs counter to a principal function of the imagination, as imagination of creative images on a plane of imaginative presence. But I recount it for no other reason that that's what we've been doing, and it seems to be quite helpful. Did you know that in the great temple at Delphi, in the Greek civilization we all came from, if you went to see a doctor because you had a physical ailment, you needed a dream. And if you didn't have a dream, they'd stick you in a little room with bread and water till you did have a dream. Because then you had something that actually showed the doctor what was really wrong with you, not what you thought was wrong with you. And I think that's rather lovely. So there's a good precedent for imagining that the inner world was something to do with one's illness, one's disease, and it's not a new idea. Now, we're faced by a whole host of new diseases. There's all this stuff we call autoimmune disease, where the body attacks itself. Nobody seems to ask the question, why on earth would the body attack itself? I mean, really, why? Why would the body attack itself? The only way to really find a satisfactory answer to that question, in my opinion, is to use the imagination. And the imagination really produces extraordinary, useful things in that dimension. So I am going to speculate just a little bit here and show you how the imagination and the way I use it has been useful in looking at some patterns of disease. There's a lovely lady called Candace Pert, and Candace Pert studied at the most distinguished Johns Hopkins Medical School in the States, and became one of the great leading neuro scientists or something. Yeah. And she states quite clearly that your body is your subconscious mind. Now, she, of course, is not involved in this tradition. But I find increasingly that a lot of modern disease is tied up with the unconscious mind, and what we call in psychological circles the shadow. And the shadow, I mean, put it this way, we all prefer that our friends see the sort of best side of us. You know, we like to go around with a nice sort of shining face and be sort of, you know, successful and good looking, or, you know, all that stuff. That's what we really want our friends to see. The shadow is all the inferior qualities we don't really particularly want people to see. And I think Christianity has done the most appalling job in making us ashamed of our shadow and moralizing about our shadow and trying to push those bits of our personalities into the shadow. And how that fits in with the notion of wholeness is quite beyond me, because these shadow qualities have to be brought into the light as part of your wholeness. When everybody's trying to get rid of their anger or rid of their lust or rid of their this or that and the next thing, they need to be brought into the light of consciousness and brought back into the circle. You need to love them. Basically, you need to love them. And I will say this. an enormous amount of modern disease comes out of the shadow, comes out of that side. So just let me give you 2 examples of how that might work. Lovely lady past the midpoint, into her 60s, finds herself alone, quite unexpectedly, for various reasons I don't need to go into. Deeply, deeply anxious about this whole new experience of being literally alone, always having been part of a larger family. And she develops, amongst other things, and I should perhaps just say this, is that various people in the family circle hadn't behaved terribly well. Let's leave it at that. She develops almost constant diarrhea. She rushes off to the doctors, and they're worried about this, and they scan her, and they do all sorts of things, and put her on steroids and all this dreadful stuff, and the diarrhea continues. She brings me a dream. And in the dream, she's in her family office, and there is a rhinoceros that has got loose in this office and is tossing everything out of the windows. Now, it's really important, this, because it's how you can miss the energy of the dream and get stuck on the image itself. So I think to myself, there's your diarrhea. You know, everything going out the window. That's it. Definitely that. She said, that's actually incredible. So I said to her, do you think we could stop this rhinoceros? Do you think, I mean, how should we, in a visualization, how could we approach this rhinoceros? Now, I have a lovely little circuit, what I call a circuit-breaking mantra, which came from another tradition that my distinguished friend here introduced me to, which is a little mantra which takes total responsibility for the situation. And it goes, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. So I said, could we try that on the rhino? So she sits there doing this. She's got much more peaceful. So I think, well, that's brilliant. We've solved the problem. The diarrhea continues. Now, I'm going to come back to this dream because we did eventually solve the problem. But to give you another disease, a woman in very similar circumstances, but with a little bit of security in the children, and then the children turn around and abandon her. And within weeks, she has a lump on the breast. Now, this is a lady who's never in her entire life wouldn't know the meaning of anger. Simply, we were brought up very nicely not to be angry, of course. So we do a visualization on this lump in the breast. And she goes in and looks at it, and this is very, very common with cancer. You can go and look at the way the tumour is, what colour it is, what you think it is. So she went in and she looked at it and said, I said, can you tell me anything about it? And she said, absolutely. It's very, very red. So I said, well, that's interesting. Anything else you could intuit by looking at this lump? She said, it's very, very cross. Now, this woman had never been cross in her life. And I said, can you feel that in the wider body? She said, I am so angry. And she had never experienced anger in herself. And because she couldn't express that anger, it came out somewhere. Well, at least that's the way I saw it. And the point I want to make is that whilst conceptually we got the rhinoceros to quieten down, she didn't actually connect to the energy of the image. I was being too clever. I should have left her alone in that office with a rhinoceros going crazy, because that was a symbol of her rage and her anger, which she tremendously badly needed to become conscious. So those are just 2 little examples of how the imagination works with such beauty in the body. And a last highly speculative one, which I'm right in the middle of, and therefore I can do nothing but speculate. But the world these days seems to be full of allergies. Everybody's got allergies. They can't eat meat, they can't do this, they can't drink that, the next thing. And I respect a lot of that because the food chain has been badly contaminated. But there's also a psychological aspect to this. And I was working with a lovely girl who couldn't drink milk. And I asked her, I said, do you know, what happens if you do? And she said, well, oh, I can feel it coming for me. I said, wow, that is so cool. I mean, that is amazing. You can? Yes, she said, I can feel it coming. And it then had all sorts of bodily symptoms. I said to her, do you think we could meet this halfway? She said, well, it's an idea. I said, how would you do that? I put my hand up. I think, now, I don't want to go any further with this because it's unresolved, but I think it's an interesting idea that there is a movement in the body that I can't, this stuff triggers something in me, which it does. It will trigger a proper physical reaction. I'm not saying it doesn't. But there may be a way of meeting it and just simply saying, hang on a minute, I quite like milk, actually. Could you just possibly behave a bit better? So that's an area of pure speculation. Now, of course, we have to be mightily careful with this, lest it sounds that what I'm trying to say is that, you know, with a touch of imagination and a bit of medication, we can solve everything. Of course we can't. The causes of disease are tremendously complex and varied, and I don't pretend to know them all. But what I do say is that it may pay us handsomely to develop a better relationship to these things. Now, finally, if I may, I've got 10 minutes to half past, is that right? Yes. If I may, just let's touch on this organ of subtle knowledge, the heart. So absolutely central in the cosmologies of India and certainly this tradition, and pretty much ignored by the West. We, I think of the heart, at least that thing there, the sort of conical thing that goes up and down, we think of that as you know, we think of sort of, it's a sort of Hollywood sort of number with sort of something to do with romance. But actually what I'm talking about is more to do with the chakra, the psychic center, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it's here, which is how, in this tradition and in other traditions, this is the organ of perception. But I find it actually unsettling. And by unsettling, I mean, I can't quite believe it, that we in our sophisticated culture didn't know that there are other centers of intelligence in the body except this thing. The Indians have known that for roughly 3,000 years. And I like to bring in my hero here, my neuroscientist Candice Pert, who carried on these researches at Johns Hopkins. And she says, very humbly, she said, if you had said to me 25 years ago that the Indian chakra system had something to teach us neurologists about the human body, I would have laughed in your face. But it was she, bless her socks, who discovered that the organs and the peptides that actually make the brain work, I don't know how the brain works, but that's what they say, how the brain works, were repeated in these chakra centers. I find it unsettling that our medical universe of functional medicine doesn't take that into account. And she ended her life saying that she really felt those centers had so much to tell us about ourselves and our states. And my Indian friends in the ashram I use in India say that more often than not, the heart chakra of the European is shut. They've just had too much. I think this is partly because we were trained and educated to use this thing. And let us be honest, there were huge dividends of using this thing. There were big payoffs. We got more comfortable and all sorts of things, so that was a good thing to use. But I think we were trained, we were trained to think, because that got us ahead in the world. But I think also partly it's that we're just ignorant that these other centers existed. And also that the texture of the creative energy of the heart is not greatly valued in our society. And it is a different texture. Corbin says the heart is the organ which produces true knowledge and comprehensive intuition of the divine mysteries. It is the organ of perception and intimate taste. I love that taste business. That slight feel of a thing. Nothing to do with facts, just the taste of it. We should trust it. Now, of course, the Christian mystics knew all this. The famous prayer of the heart speaks to that. And I think, again, we've just forgotten it. The poor old heart presents itself in my work more often than not as a heart attack or a heart bypass operation. And in the world in metaphor which I live in, one has to wonder a bit why it was necessary for the individual to bypass his or her heart. But I have come to feel in my work that it's not only helpful, deeply helpful to contemplate the heart and to locate all one's meditative practices there, but it's really almost essential in getting us out of our busy, literal stuff going on up here. And it's much easier, if you locate yourself here, to let the thoughts drain out of the head here and learn to be still and more peaceful. So, yeah, you have to work at it. Sorry, that's the bad news. You can't just take a pill. It's like hard work. You have to go back in there and keep doing that. And I do that very much with my clients. Now, all my little meditative clips I make, they can put on their telephones. I'll bring them back in here, learn to be in here, persevere at being in here, in a little cavern behind the heart. Just take your awareness in there and just sit there until you can feel the texture changing. A lady I've been working with said to me the other day, I found, she looked at me in complete amazement and said, I found there are some things I can deal with in my heart I just can't face if I think about them, which I thought was rather beautiful. Now, this, I'm almost through. So this last example is, for me, really extraordinary because it actually happens to connect so beautifully to this tradition we're discussing. Lady in her mid-40s, whole history of early abuse, a whole ladder of dysfunction. She was carrying around with her a feeling of dread in the stomach. This terrible thing you wake up with in the morning, like that. And it was permanent, she'd had it for a long time, it was deep and really terrible. So we did a visualization on it. And what she saw was, unsurprisingly, a lump of lead. And it was very dense and very, very heavy. And I suggested to her, was it possible to take this image of the lead up into the heart center? Yeah. And she said, and these are her words, it has become a pyre, please note, of dead bodies. Now, I said, just keep contemplating it. But she had said it was a pyre, and I must confess, I was wondering if it would burst into flames. And it did. And she sat there for, I should think, a good 4 or 5 minutes, just watching the flames consume this whole pile of, you could say, dead angels, actually. And when she eventually opened her eyes, she said the dread had gone. Now, this lady had, so yes, now we shouldn't be too surprised about this, because Ibn Arabi in his wonderful Diwan has this beautiful, beautiful thing about the creativity of the heart when he says, "O marvel, a garden among the flames. My heart has become capable of all forms." The lady I spoke of course, had never heard of Ibn Arabi, or indeed the Sufis. So I only say that because there's like a universal idea that seems to be helpful. Well, I think that's really pretty much all I have to say. It is, for me, this notion that psychotherapy needs to use basically spiritual tools. And a lot of them don't. So you've just got this literal dialogue, which goes on for years. And they sit there talking to like two old boys in a club for years and years, and absolutely nothing changes. And it isn't until you engage this invisible world, this inner world, that things begin to happen very, very fast. And it's an enormous privilege to work with. In the end, however, really the only tool we have in psychotherapy that's really any good is you have to love the people you're working with. Because if you don't love the people you're working with, frankly, go and be a bus driver or something. Now, whether any of us will be able to say at the end of our journey, as did our Fedeli d'Amore of Iran, I profess the religion of love. And whatever direction its steed will take me in, love is my religion and my faith. Thank you.